Hollywood sold you a fantasy. Oiled muscles. Wild chaos. Thumbs down. Instant death. Reality? Gladiators were bound by contracts, dress codes, referees, medical supervision, stage names, even retirement paperwork. Rome didn't run a slaughterhouse. It ran a system. These are 44 insane rules real gladiators had to follow, and once you hear them, those movie scenes will look embarrassingly fake. 1. Let's dismantle the Hollywood six-pack myth immediately because gladiators were not sculpted fitness influencers. Arena doctors and trainers intentionally pushed fighters toward a high-carb diet centered around barley, beans, and legumes, creating a thicker layer of body fat over the muscles. Lean definition was not the goal, survivability was. That extra padding acted like natural shock absorption, helping protect vital organs from shallow cuts and reducing the risk of catastrophic bleeding. They were even nicknamed barley men by some Roman writers, proof that peak performance in the arena looked very different from modern gym culture. 2. You would think a fight to the death is just a chaotic free-for-all, but the arena floor was heavily regulated by literal referees. These official judges were called the summa rudis, and stadium protocols dictated they stand right in the middle of the flying blades wearing crisp white tunics. If a gladiator tried a banned dirty move, lost his rhythm, or suffered a broken helmet strap, the referee would literally beat the armed killer with a massive wooden stick. Combatants were absolutely forced to freeze in place instantly while the official fixed equipment or yelled at them. It was essentially an insanely violent boxing match with a technical timeout policy. 3. Dropping your sword and begging for mercy was highly illegal and guaranteed an immediate execution for sheer cowardice. The Roman arena ran on strict bureaucracy, even during a frantic bloodbath. If a severely wounded fighter wanted to officially surrender, custom required him to perform a highly specific sequence of gestures. He had to lower his shield, step backward, and raise a single index finger straight into the sky. Only this exact motion triggered an official pause in the combat. Once that finger went up, both fighters had to freeze like statues while the entire stadium prepared to take a loud, terrifying vote on whether the loser got to keep his head. 4. Speaking of that crowd vote, movies taught you that a thumbs down meant immediate death, but the actual historical reality was the exact opposite. When a fighter surrendered, the crowd voted using a gesture called pollis verso, meaning a turned thumb. Historians actually agree that extending your thumb upward or pointing it toward the throat signaled a drawn sword and demanded a kill. To grant mercy, the organizers required the crowd to press their thumbs down or hide them tightly inside a closed fist, symbolizing a perfectly sheathed weapon. If you ever travel back in time to the Colosseum and give a defeated fighter an enthusiastic thumbs up, you just ordered his execution. 5. A gladiator never truly owned his own bodily fluids due to a highly lucrative and deeply absurd hygiene practice. After a long training session, a fighter was required to stand perfectly still, while a servant used a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape every ounce of sweat and dirt off his skin. This was not just about staying clean. The arena managers aggressively collected all of this dirty gladiator sweat, bottled it into tiny glass vials, and sold it at an astronomical markup to wealthy aristocrats. It was marketed as a luxury cosmetic and charm, meaning your exhausting workout was actually a heavily regulated manufacturing process for ancient perfume. 6. Volunteering for the arena required signing the most genuinely terrifying legal contract ever conceived, known as the Octoramentum. A surprisingly high number of free Roman citizens signed up to escape crushing debt, but the entry requirement was absolutely brutal. By swearing this mandatory oath, a free man formally agreed to be burned by fire, bound in heavy chains, beaten with iron rods, and slain by the sword. The exact second you repeated those horrific words to the magistrate, your civil rights instantly vanished. You were officially downgraded from a human being to literal talking property, exchanging your freedom for a signing bonus and a decent chance of being decapitated by Tuesday. 7. Warming up before a heavy physical event is standard, but the Roman arena had a mandatory theatrical warm-up where gladiators had to fake fight before the real event. Before any actual combat began, the grand procession demanded a period of purely simulated combat called the preluzio. Fighters were handed blunt wooden weapons and ordered to passionately act out thrilling combat sequences, entirely to hype up the incredibly impatient crowd. You were forced to perform a beautifully choreographed, highly dramatic dance of dodging and striking, wasting your precious energy just to ensure the aristocratic spectators were properly entertained before the serious, historical spectacle officially started. 8. Fighting for your glory was stressful enough, but stadium management strictly demanded you do it to a live musical soundtrack. You were not just swinging weapons, you were performing a highly choreographed historical ballet. A live band playing massive brass horns and a giant water-powered pipe organ called a hydraulis blasted incredibly loud music right at the edge of the sand. The bizarre catch was that the tempo of the music had to perfectly match the intensity of the combat. If the musicians played a fast, frantic rhythm, you were expected to move faster. You were essentially forced to perfectly synchronize your survival tactics with an ancient brass band. 9. Freezing weather was absolutely no excuse to cover up, because wearing long pants was strictly outlawed in the Roman arena. The imperial elite viewed trousers as filthy barbarian clothing, completely unfit for civilized society. The lanista enforced a rigid dress code demanding bare legs at all times, no matter how cold the winter wind howling through the Colosseum became. You could wear a massive bronze helmet that weighed 20 pounds and strap thick metal plates to your dominant arm, but your legs had to remain totally exposed to the elements to prove you were a proper warrior. Trembling from a freezing breeze while trying to look intimidating was an absurd daily reality. 10. Killing your opponent without permission was technically considered massive property damage. Because these elite fighters were worth a ridiculous fortune, stadium contracts heavily penalized unauthorized fatalities. If you accidentally killed a superstar warrior without the explicit approval of the stadium sponsor, the politician hosting the event had to pay the trainer an astronomical replacement fee. The financial reality was designed to force a surrender, not a funeral, meaning you had to master the absolute most difficult martial art in history. You had to aggressively and violently dominate a heavily armored, highly trained killer without actually letting him bleed out on the sand, requiring an insane level of professional restraint. 11. Being naturally left-handed is completely normal today, but in the Roman arena, it triggered a very specific and highly prized tactical advantage. If a trainer discovered a recruit favored their left hand, they strictly forbade them from switching to their right. In ancient Rome, left-handedness was generally considered unlucky and sinister, but in the training schools, it was a massive strategic asset. Because almost everyone trained exclusively against right-handed opponents, a left-handed fighter moved in completely unnatural angles, totally confusing their challengers. These unique fighters were heavily protected by their managers and kept as surprise secret weapons to guarantee an unpredictable spectacle for the cheering crowds. 12. Getting a tattoo is a personal choice now. But for a Roman gladiator, receiving permanent ink was an unbreakable policy and highly degrading. The imperial trainers enforced a mandate where fighters had to be permanently branded or tattooed, often right on their face, legs, or hands. This was definitely not for decorative, artistic expression. The ink served as an ancient barcode, clearly marking the fighter as the official property of a specific training school or an elite Roman politician. If a fighter somehow managed to escape the heavily guarded barracks, their own face would immediately betray them to the authorities, making this cosmetic procedure the ultimate anti-theft security system. 13. Playing dead to escape the arena was strictly impossible due to a highly aggressive post-match protocol. If a fighter fell and did not move, stadium guidelines required attendants dressed as the underworld gods Charon and Mercury to perform a mandatory death check. The instructions dictated they smash the fallen gladiator on the forehead with a heavy wooden mallet and aggressively burn their skin with a blistering hot iron wand. The organizers had absolutely zero trust in these desperate men, meaning you were forced to undergo a terrifyingly violent, red-hot physical examination right on the sand just to prove you had actually passed away. 14. Female gladiators absolutely existed. but they were treated as a rare and heavily controlled spectacle rather than a normal division. Historical records show that when women entered the arena, it was usually as a special novelty event staged by elite sponsors hungry for something shocking and new. They often fought other women under torchlight during evening games, turning the match into a dramatic theatrical event. The crowd wasn't watching just a fight. They were witnessing a social boundary being bent in real time, because Rome loved spectacle even more than it loved tradition. 15. Gladiators had a mandatory ancient sports drink that sounds like an absolute nightmare for your taste buds. Arena doctors imposed a strict dietary regulation forcing fighters to chug a thick, bitter beverage made entirely of sour vinegar and wood ash after every single training session. This was not some bizarre punishment, but a highly calculated medical requirement. The heavy ash mixture was packed with calcium and magnesium, scientifically designed to strengthen their bones and help them recover from heavy bruising. Imagine finishing an exhausting workout in the hot sun, and your coach hands you a cup of fireplace sweepings mixed with stale wine. They drank it perfectly willingly for peak conditioning. 16. Eating your dinner in absolute peace was strictly forbidden the night before a grand event. Gladiators were forced to attend a mandatory public banquet called the Cena Libera, which was essentially a bizarre spectator sport all on its own. The fighters sat at heavily decorated tables overflowing with expensive food, but the catch was that the general public was invited to wander around and stare at them while they chewed. Fans would closely observe their favorite fighters, aggressively analyzing their appetite and mood to predict their performance for the next day. You were entirely obligated to casually eat your bread and cheese while hundreds of strangers judged your every single bite. 17. Having long, flowing locks blowing in the wind is a classic, heroic image, but stadium managers strictly banned gladiators from growing their hair out. The training schools enforced a mandatory grooming policy requiring fighters to keep their heads either completely shaved or buzzed incredibly short. This was a highly practical defensive strategy, not a fashion statement. In close quarters combat, long hair was basically a convenient handle for your opponent to grab, drag you down to the sand, and instantly win the match. Furthermore, the heavy, incredibly intricate bronze helmets they wore simply would not fit correctly over a thick head of hair, making this extreme haircut a vital survival requirement. 18. Winning an exhausting match meant the wildly excited crowd would often throw expensive coins and beautiful jewelry right onto the sand, but a frustrating financial catch stated you could not keep it immediately. As a bound gladiator, everything you touched technically belonged to the lanista who owned your contract. You had to humbly gather up all the shiny gold thrown by your adoring fans and immediately hand every single piece over to your trainer. You were only allowed to keep the treasure if the lanista generously decided to grant you a small bonus from your own hard-earned shower of gifts. Superstar warriors literally had to beg their masters to keep their own tips. 19. The Esidari class entered the stadium looking incredibly majestic on fast two-wheeled chariots, but stadium traditions strictly forbade them from finishing the fight inside their vehicle. Organizers required them to spectacularly crash or aggressively jump out of their speeding chariot and finish the duel entirely on foot. You basically got to look like a glorious racing god for about 3 minutes before the officials forced you to abandon your incredibly expensive war machine and sprint through the dirt like a common infantryman. The sheer ridiculousness of hyping up a glorious chariot battle only to mandate a pedestrian fistfight was top-tier Roman logic. 20. Wealthy sponsors enforced a strict psychological tactic requiring fighters to wear massive, completely enclosed helmets equipped with heavy metal grills over the eyes. This was not just for supreme facial protection against sharp objects. The underlying historical purpose was to entirely dehumanize the fighters, turning them into faceless, emotionless statues. If the drunken spectators could clearly see the extreme exhaustion in a young warrior's eyes, they might actually feel a shred of human empathy. By locking their faces behind claustrophobic iron cages, the organizers ensured the cheering crowd only saw anonymous bronze armor crashing together instead of actual sweating, panicked people fighting for their lives. 21. Professional fighters were absolutely terrified of bad luck, so stadium officials had to officially ban the use of dark magic and underground curses. Before a major tournament, highly nervous combatants frequently tried to secretly bury small lead tablets inscribed with bizarre spells right under the stadium dirt. These forbidden items contained highly specific requests to ancient gods, asking them to mysteriously paralyze an opponent or make a rival completely blind. The authorities treated this mystical cheating incredibly seriously, conducting sweeping searches to confiscate the illegal magical contraband. You could be a heavily armed giant, but you still honestly believed a tiny scratched piece of lead would completely ruin your career. 22. Cowardice was strictly punished, unless you were officially assigned to the retiarius class, which basically required you to run away. Because this specific fighter was only armed with a fishing net and a trident, stadium combat expectations were completely inverted. While heavily armored fighters were forced to stand their ground, the net fighter was practically mandated to sprint away in sheer panic, forcing his heavy opponent to chase him around the hot sand. The entire survival strategy was based on hilarious cardio exhaustion. The crowd would scream with laughter as a giant armored tank of a man fruitlessly chased a half-naked guy doing frantic wind sprints across the arena floor. 23. Gladiators received an unusually high level of medical attention compared to most people in the Roman world, not out of kindness, but because they were valuable financial assets. Training schools employed experienced physicians who monitored wounds, prescribed specialized diets, and oversaw recovery with oils, massages, and controlled exercise. Skeletal evidence shows that many healed from severe injuries that would have killed ordinary citizens. The logic was brutally practical. A well-maintained fighter generated profit. In a society where most laborers were disposable, gladiators were maintained like prized racehorses. 24. Gladiators did not train with their actual weapons. Trainers forced them to practice with wooden swords and shields deliberately built heavier than the real ones. Not slightly heavier, significantly heavier. This meant every swing during training felt like dragging a log through hot air. By comparison, the real metal blade on fight day felt unnervingly light and dangerously fast. It was controlled overexertion as strategy. The crowd saw explosive speed in the arena. What they didn't see was months of swinging something that felt like medieval gym equipment designed by a sadist. 25. Choosing your own weapons sounds like basic common sense if your life is on the line, but stadium organizers absolutely forbade it. You did not get to browse the armory and pick the sharpest sword. The Roman games were built on a rigid system of asymmetrical matchmaking. If you were assigned the Theatrical class, you were forced to use a tiny shield and a severely curved blade. You were then deliberately paired against a myrmillo, a walking tank with a massive shield and a heavy helmet. The organizers intentionally rigged the equipment loadouts to create maximum anxiety, forcing fighters to solve complex tactical puzzles while bleeding in the sand. 26. Daily oiling and deep muscle manipulation were not optional luxuries. They were mandatory maintenance protocols. Trainers employed specialized attendants whose job was to scrape, stretch, knead, and oil the fighters' bodies whether they felt like it or not. It wasn't spa culture, it was asset preservation. A tight hamstring could mean a slow reaction. A slow reaction could mean death. So even if you were bruised, exhausted, or furious, someone was going to aggressively work your muscles like you were a prized warhorse. In Rome, recovery wasn't self-care. It was survival economics. 27. Some gladiator helmets were deliberately designed to severely restrict vision, especially for heavily armored classes like the myrmillo and the secutor. These massive bronze helmets featured tiny eye slits and thick metal grills that drastically narrowed peripheral vision and trapped heat inside like an oven. Fighters trained for months just to adapt to breathing hot air and seeing the world through narrow horizontal cracks. The design wasn't accidental. It increased tension, forced close combat, and made every duel feel claustrophobic and brutally intimate for both the fighter and the roaring crowd. 28. Gladiators were not just blood-splattered fighters. They were legally tied into formal Brotherhood associations that functioned like ancient insurance cartels. Membership was often mandatory, and a portion of their prize money was siphoned into a communal treasury. Why? Because death was expected, not hypothetical. If you died in the arena, this fund paid for your funeral, your tombstone, and sometimes financial support for your family. Imagine training all week knowing your coworkers are also your future pallbearers, and you're all contributing to a shared just in case one of us gets decapitated account. That's not a team spirit poster. That's structured mortality planning. 29. If you trained as a provocator, the arena forced you into one of the most psychologically brutal setups imaginable. You were only allowed to fight another provocator wearing identical armor, identical shield, identical weapon. No gimmicks, no asymmetry, no clever tactical advantage. Just a mirrored version of yourself standing across the sand. It stripped away spectacle and exposed pure skill. The crowd wasn't watching a clash of opposites. They were watching two carbon copies trying to prove which one deserved to exist. It was less a duel and more an existential audit conducted with sharp metal. 30. The incredibly bizarre scissor class was forced to fight while looking exactly like a one-armed eccentric. The bizarre equipment requirements for this specific fighter completely banned the use of a traditional shield or a normal sword. Instead, they were instructed to shove their entire left arm inside a hollow steel tube, equipped with a vicious semicircular blade attached to the end. You were essentially expected to fight while wearing a giant iron gauntlet equipped with a massive cheese knife. The entire tactical doctrine of this class relied on aggressively punching the air to slash at your opponent, turning a highly trained ancient athlete into an aggressive mechanical contraption. 31. The Krupalari were infamous for their unusually heavy armor, inspired by tribal Gallic war gear that encased much of the body in layered metal plates. Unlike standard gladiators who balanced mobility and defense, these fighters prioritized intimidation and sheer durability. Moving in that much iron required tremendous stamina and conditioning, turning every step into effort. Their fights were slower, grinding contests of endurance rather than speed. The visual impact alone was staggering. Two metallic figures clashing under the sun, sparks flying, the sound echoing like a forge instead of a battlefield. 32. Certain specialized gladiator types relied on flexible weapons instead of standard swords, forcing them to fight in completely unconventional ways. The Retiarius, for example, wielded a weighted net and a trident, but inscriptions also mention fighters who experimented with ropes and entangling tactics to unbalance heavily armored opponents. Imagine facing a charging man wrapped in steel, while your entire strategy depended on timing a perfectly thrown cord around his shield or ankle. It transformed the arena into a high-stakes chess match played at full sprint, where one mistake meant instant steel to the ribs. 33. Using your given birth name in the arena was incredibly rare, as you were strongly encouraged by your lanista to adopt a ridiculously over-the-top stage name. The historical records show this was an unwritten industry standard of pure, theatrical hype. You could not just walk out onto the sand as a regular guy named Marcus. You had to officially register as something completely absurd like Eurus the Wild Ox, or purely intimidating titles like Ferox, which literally meant fierce. Some fighters took the absolutely opposite route and chose names like Narcissus or Pearl. Imagine a terrifying warrior built like a brick wall being loudly introduced to the Emperor as Little Pearl. 34. Keeping your nightmares a secret was not an option, because reporting your dreams to a professional fortune teller was a mandatory superstition. The training schools employed specialized dream interpreters, and fighters were heavily pressured to consult them the morning before any major event. If you dreamed of an eagle or a victorious crown, you were cleared to fight with supreme confidence. However, if you simply dreamed of a broken cup or a cloudy sky, the historical omens declared you were totally doomed. Trainers took these ancient superstitions so seriously that a meaningless bad dream could cause absolute panic, forcing towering warriors to delay matches just because they imagined a weird bird. 35. Enjoying personal space was completely against the rules, as gladiators were forced to live in incredibly cramped, highly regulated living quarters. The lanista strictly ensured fighters were locked into tiny windowless stone cells, often measuring only a few square feet. However, this absurd housing situation came with a hilarious paradox. Because these men were worth an absolute fortune to their wealthy patrons, these tiny, cramped cells were heavily guarded around the clock by armed security. It meant that while the fighters had absolutely zero freedom and lived in essentially a fortified closet, they were ironically enjoying the safest, most fiercely protected real estate in all of ancient Rome. 36. You could not simply resign from your job by handing in a notice, because retirement required a very specific piece of wood. The arena operated on the tradition of the rudis, a small wooden sword that served as the ultimate legal symbol of freedom. No matter how wealthy a gladiator became or how many grand victories he secured, he was legally bound to the arena until an official sponsor physically handed him this cheap wooden toy. It created a beautifully absurd scenario where towering superstars would practically beg their bosses for a wooden practice stick, because that single piece of timber was the only recognized loophole to break their lifetime contract. 37. Gladiator promotions revolved around a wooden training post called the palace, and your rank in the school literally depended on how effectively you could assault a tree trunk. The best fighter earned the title First Palace, which came with better food, better treatment, and higher status. New recruits? They were assigned lower numbers and ordered to hack at the post for hours under supervision. Your entire reputation was built on how violently and precisely you could strike a stationary piece of wood. In a world obsessed with spectacle, your career ladder started by proving you could dominate an object that never fought back. 38. Screaming in pain seems like a perfectly natural human reaction, but the training schools strictly prohibited gladiators from making a single sound when injured. The lanista drilled an ironclad philosophy of unbreakable stoicism into every single fighter. You were expected to accept strikes, cuts, and even defeat with a completely blank, emotionless expression. Flinching, crying out, or showing any visible panic was considered highly disgraceful and could cost you the sympathy of the watching emperor. The crowd demanded a theatrical display of supreme courage, meaning these warriors had to practice getting hit with heavy wooden swords while maintaining the calm, bored facial expression of a stone statue. 39. The sponsor of the games, known as the editor, held enormous authority over how a match concluded. While established rules structured most fights, the final decision about mercy or death ultimately rested in his hands. He could accept the crowd's demand, overrule it, or choose a dramatic ending that amplified his own political image. The arena was not just a sporting venue, it was a stage for power. A single gesture from the sponsor could transform a wounded man's fate in seconds, reminding everyone in the stadium exactly who controlled life, death, and public favor. 40. A terrifying architectural nightmare built right into the Colosseum floor meant combatants could never truly trust the ground beneath their feet. Fighters were strictly forbidden from complaining when the arena staff secretly utilized a massive hidden network of subterranean trapdoors and mechanical wooden elevators. Right in the middle of a tense duel, a referee could pull a hidden lever and suddenly launch a highly confused leopard or a massive fake mountain right between the two combatants. The situation demanded absolute situational awareness because you were not just fighting a man with a weapon, you were battling the actual real estate. One wrong step and the floor would literally spit out an angry bear. 41. Fighting equipment was strictly separated from parade equipment, meaning gladiators had to play an absurd game of dress-up before doing anything else. Imperial protocols dictated that the grand opening procession required fighters to wear incredibly elaborate, ridiculously heavy armor covered in gold, giant ostrich feathers, and embossed faces. This gear was purely decorative and weighed so much that you could barely walk straight, let alone swing a heavy weapon. This was strictly enforced to impress the wealthy crowd with dazzling reflections and absurd theatricality. Once the parade finally ended, they were ordered to strip it all off and put on their actual, much less glamorous training gear. 42. Signing up to fight professionally as a free citizen came with a very strict, highly bizarre expiration date. Unlike the captured prisoners who were legally condemned to the sand for life, a wealthy citizen facing bankruptcy could sign a volunteer contract that lasted exactly 5 years. During this strange half-decade, you completely surrendered your human rights and lived exactly like the lowest captive in the barracks. But the very second that 5-year timer ran out, your contract instantly evaporated. You could simply pack up your belongings, collect your final pouch of prize money, and walk right out the front gate as a totally free and highly respected gentleman. 43. Calling a top-tier arena superstar an animal hunter was a massive insult and a huge violation of their strict social hierarchy. Movies constantly show legendary heroes fighting tigers, but historical class systems created a massive divide between true gladiators and the lower-class beast fighters. The professionals exclusively trained to duel other highly skilled human beings in a beautifully choreographed display of martial arts. Being ordered to run around the dirt chasing an angry wild boar was considered completely beneath their dignity and assigned to completely different performers. Suggesting a champion swordsman should go wrestle a leopard was the ancient equivalent of asking a master chef to take out the garbage. 44. Ending a highly anticipated duel in a perfectly peaceful tie sounds completely absurd for a dangerous public spectacle, but it was a completely valid and highly celebrated outcome. If two incredibly skilled champions fought for hours under the boiling sun without anyone gaining a clear advantage, the stadium officials could invoke a special verdict called standing dismissed. Both exhausted fighters simply stopped swinging, mutually acknowledged their equal skill, and walked away entirely unharmed with massive respect from the roaring crowd. The wealthy organizers absolutely hated doing this because they spent a fortune on the spectacle. But the system actually allowed these exhausted athletes to basically call it a draw and take a nap. Now you've seen the machine behind the myth. Contracts, votes, branding, insurance funds, wooden swords for freedom. So here's the real question. What rule did we miss that Hollywood never dares to show? Drop the one detail you think should have been on this list. And if this hit harder than any Gladiator movie you've seen, like it, subscribe, and step back into the arena with us.